The hall shone under the light of the crystal chandeliers, glasses clinked, and the guests wore forced smiles. In the corner, the blonde maid, young and delicate, crossed the space carrying a tray. Her posture was discreet, almost invisible, but the watchful eyes of the millionaire's wife were unforgiving. A small slip, a glass that shook, a drop of wine that nearly ran down the marble, was enough for her employer to expose her before everyone. The woman's voice cut through the hall like a blade. Insults, accusations, humiliations. The blonde lowered her head, her eyes welling with tears, feeling the guests' quiet laughter like knives in her chest. The millionaire watched in silence, motionless, as if her suffering were just part of the evening's spectacle. But no one imagined that this seemingly defenseless young woman was harboring a secret capable of turning the entire party upside down. As the guests laughed, and the wife lifted her chin in triumph, the maid took a deep breath. A tear fell, but her eyes shone differently. It wasn't just pain, it was something hidden deep within her. Amidst the humiliation, a detail escaped her notice. A pendant that slipped from her uniform, glinting in the chandelier's light. Some guests glanced at each other, recognizing the engraved symbol. The murmur began quietly but grew, spreading through the room like wildfire. The wife, convinced of her victory, hadn't yet noticed, but the millionaire had already turned pale. Eyes turned to the maid, as if she were suddenly no longer just a servant. Tension turned to anticipation, and everyone sensed it. That night was about to reveal something no one would ever forget. If you felt the power of this story in these first moments, imagine what's yet to come. Every detail holds a twist. Every silence conceals a weight. Take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel so you can journey together to the end of this narrative where destiny always reveals its face. Night fell over the mansion like a golden veil, illuminated by outdoor torches and the immense crystal chandeliers that sparkled in the grand ballroom. It was one of those parties designed to impress. Guests in suits and long dresses, champagne glasses raised in automatic toasts, sharp conversations, and fake laughter that echoed like rehearsed music. Every detail exuded luxury, but also arrogance. Between discreet waiters and tuxedoed musicians, the blonde maid walked almost invisibly. Young, delicately beautiful. She wore the shortest, most youthful uniform, with the suggestive neckline the millionaire's wife demanded, as if she were just another ornament in the house. The blonde kept her eyes lowered, balancing a tray of sparkling glasses. Her posture was impeccable, but the slightest slip-up could make her a target. And that night, the slip-up came. A drop of wine ran down the rim of a glass. Just that, a red thread, barely visible in the light, but it was enough. The millionaire's wife, seated queenly, in the center of the room, saw it and smirked. That was all she needed to transform the maid into a spectacle. Useless! Her voice cut through the hall, sharp and loud enough to silence the musicians. You even do wrong when holding a glass? Eyes turned to the blonde. Some guests smiled discreetly, complicit in the pleasure of watching someone else's humiliation. Others looked away, but not out of pity, simply to avoid being associated with the mistake. The young woman trembled. Her fingers almost dropped the tray, but she regained her composure. The tear that was welling up in her eyes clung to it, reluctant to fall. The wife stood, her heels echoing against the polished marble. She approached with measured steps, as if savoring every second before delivering the final blow. The hall watched the spectacle, and the maid, motionless, became the target of her sharp words. You should be thankful for working here, instead of ruining my party with your incompetence, he shouted, drawing muffled laughter from the audience. The millionaire watched in silence. His look wasn't one of surprise, but of convenience. He didn't move a finger, didn't react. To him, the scene was just another part of the social theater that kept his wife entertained and his guests satisfied. The blonde, head bowed, breathed deeply, as if each breath were a battle. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling, but there was something different in her teary eyes, something no one noticed right away. It wasn't just pain. It was as if behind her fragility there was something hidden, a silent truth pulsing and waiting for the right moment to emerge. And in that instant, As the laughter echoed, fate began to change, even if no one could have imagined it. The muffled laughter echoed through the room like a cruel chorus. The millionaire's wife stood before the blonde maid, her blue eyes sparkling with triumph. For her, humiliating someone wasn't just punishment for a minor mistake. It was a way to reassert her power over the audience. Each insult uttered was less about the stained wine glass and more about the pleasure of reducing someone to dust. "Look closely," he exclaimed, raising his voice for all to hear. "That's why some people never get anywhere. Incompetence, lack of care, lack of class." Some guests laughed out loud, others merely exchanged knowing glances, as if approving of the spectacle. The millionaire remained motionless, glass of whiskey in hand, observing the scene as if watching a play. He didn't intervene, he didn't defend himself. His neutrality was, in itself, a sentence against the young woman. The blonde maid trembled, but held the tray steady in her hands. Her teary eyes tried to hide the shame burning in her chest. Each word was like a blade, but something inside her resisted. It was as if, behind her short uniform and delicate appearance, there was an invisible shield, fragile, but present. The wife took another step forward, so close that the strong, cloying perfume enveloped her like a prison. She leaned in, her lips close to the maid's ear, and whispered venomously, but loud enough for those closest to her to hear, "You will never be more than that. A shadow. A disgrace to be in my house." The young woman swallowed hard. A tear finally escaped, sliding down her delicate face. The room vibrated in silence, as if that moment were the final note of a cruel symphony. But instead of bowing, she simply set down the tray and, with trembling hands held tightly to a small pendant that had discreetly come loose from her uniform. The object glinted in the chandelier's light, a barely noticeable detail, but enough to draw a gasp of surprise from a woman sitting nearby. Her eyes widened. She touched her husband's arm and murmured, "I know that symbol." The comment spread like a spark through dry straw. Other guests gathered closer, trying to get a better look. His wife, still satisfied with her humiliation, didn't notice the detail. But the millionaire, with a quick glance at the pendant, momentarily lost his indifferent expression. His face paled, and his hand tightened around the whiskey glass. The maid noticed his reaction. Her teary eyes met his for a brief second, and in that look there was something new. No longer just submission, but a spark of power. The buzz grew. The room, which until then had been amused by the humiliation, now began to be divided between curiosity and discomfort. The laughter faded. The show was changing direction, and the wife unknowingly continued to speak as if she dominated the scene. "I hope this serves as a lesson to everyone," he declared, lifting his chin. "In this house, mistakes are not tolerated." But the attention was no longer on her. Everyone was looking at the blonde, at the discreet glow that now hung from her uniform like a secret about to be revealed. The room, once filled with laughter and toasts, was now filled with whispers that snaked from one corner to the other. Like an invisible electric current, the gleam of the pendant that hung discreetly from the maid's uniform had become the new center of attention. What was supposed to be a spectacle of humiliation was transformed into a stage for suspicion. Some guests leaned in to get a better look. Others whispered names of ancient families, disputed inheritances, symbols only known to a privileged few. Some frowned, surprised to see the blonde in her uniform carrying a detail that didn't suit the simple life of a maid. The millionaire, realizing the turn of events, swallowed hard. His face, previously indifferent, was now marked by barely concealed tension. He tried to hide it with a quick sip of whiskey, but his trembling hand betrayed his nervousness. His wife, however, hadn't noticed yet. She was still erect, savoring her supposed victory, believing she was the absolute master of the show. The maid, tears still streaming down her face, noticed the growing silence and the stares focused on her. For a moment, she considered hiding the pendant back under the fabric of her uniform, but decided against it. She remained still, allowing it to shine in the intense light of the chandelier. It was as if, finally, she was allowing her truth to emerge without words. "I've seen that symbol before," the elderly woman repeated, now louder, so that others could hear. The room held its breath. Her husband nodded, his eyes fixed on the pendant. It's impossible, but it's the Aaron's family crest. The name echoed through the room like a suppressed thunderclap. Many reacted in shock, others covered their mouths in disbelief. The millionaire tightened his grip on the glass, his jaw tense, and looked away. The wife, finally noticing the change in mood, turned to the guests, confused. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to maintain her superiority. But her voice was no longer resonating. All eyes were on the blonde waitress. She, for her part, remained firm, even with her heart racing. Her teary eyes now had a different expression, dignity. She didn't need to defend herself, she didn't need to shout. She just stood there, erect, allowing the truth to speak for itself. The murmur became a wave. "Could it be that you're a distant relative? It can't be a coincidence. But what if it's true?" Each sentence increased the tension. The entire room was no longer sure whether they were witnessing a celebration or a veiled trial. The millionaire, desperate to regain control, raised his voice. "Enough!" he shouted, trying to silence the comments, but the effect was the opposite. His loud voice only reinforced his insecurity. His gaze, which should have commanded respect, now betrayed panic. His wife stared at him suspiciously, finally realizing there was something he knew and had been hiding for a long time. The scene was no longer hers, nor his. It belonged to the maid, who, without lifting a finger, had transformed the party into a silent courtroom. And everyone knew. What was coming next could no longer be contained. The millionaire's wife felt the ground tremble beneath her stiletto heels, not literally, but from the sudden shift in the air. The room, which seconds before had vibrated with her sharp words, now seemed to slip from her grasp. She noticed the eyes turning to the blonde maid, and the triumphant smile on her lips began to falter. "What are they whispering about?" she asked, trying to assert herself, but her authority no longer held the same weight. The guests were no longer listening. They all stared at the pendant shining against the maid's uniform. She took a deep breath, tried to laugh it off, turn it into a joke. "Are you impressed by her cheap pendant?" she asked sarcastically. "It's just costume jewelry, nothing more." But no one laughed. On the contrary, the comment sounded weak, like a poorly sewn disguise. One of the older guests, a renowned diplomat, took a few steps forward and spoke softly, but firmly enough for everyone to hear. "No, this symbol isn't a piece of jewelry. It's the Aaron's crest, a family that would never allow its name to be used on anything fake." The revelation fell like a sentence. The buzz exploded, growing like wildfire. The guests looked at each other, shocked, anxious, as if each had just witnessed a forbidden secret being revealed before everyone. The wife felt her face flush with anger. She turned to her husband, seeking some reassurance, but found only silence. The millionaire, his eyes downcast, avoided confrontation. His face betrayed more than words could. He already knew. He had always known. "You," she whispered, trembling, her eyes fixed on him. "Did you know that?" He didn't answer. He just raised the glass to his lips, trying to hide his panic. But the silence was the worst confirmation. The maid, tears still streaming down her face, remained motionless. Her heart was racing, but she didn't move. She didn't need to. Every second she stood there, with the pendant exposed, it was as if the entire room were being dragged into an uncomfortable truth. The wife, desperate, tried to regain control of the scene. She approached the maid with firm steps, reaching out to snatch the pendant. "Give me that," she ordered. But before she could touch it, the young woman gripped the necklace tightly, stopping her. Her blue eyes met her employer's with unexpected intensity. It was the first time that night she had faced someone head-on, without backing down. The hall held its breath. The scene had changed. The wife was no longer the executioner, and the maid was no longer the victim. It was a silent clash, but so powerful that everyone felt its weight. And in the background, the millionaire watched, pale, knowing that every second of silence only increased the inevitability of the revelation. The hall was in an uproar. The murmur grew in intensity, turning into waves of increasingly loud murmurs. The Aaron's family name had already spread far and wide, and even those who pretended not to care now eyed the maid with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The wife, realizing her victory was slipping away, tried with all her might to regain control. "Are you all out of your minds?" he shouted, raising his arms as if to silence everyone present. "You're making such a big deal out of a ridiculous detail. This girl is just a maid." But her voice no longer held authority. The eyes that had previously followed her now shifted, riveted to the blonde in uniform, who stood motionless, her pendant prominently displayed. With every passing second, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer a pageant. It was a silent courtroom. The millionaire, still motionless, didn't dare look at his wife. His expression betrayed what he was trying to hide: panic. His silence was the confirmation everyone needed. If there hadn't been truth behind the pendant, he would have stood up to deny it. But his trembling mouth remained closed. The maid, for her part, took a deep breath. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on her, but she no longer trembled. The fear was still there, but mixed with something new, the knowledge that her story could no longer be buried. With every second, the room transformed, and she ceased to be the victim and became the mystery everyone wanted to decipher. A bolder guest approached, and with her eyes fixed on the pendant, asked aloud, "Where did you get that?" The question echoed, and everyone waited for the answer. The blonde looked up, and even with tears still streaking her face, her expression was firm. But before she could answer, her wife stepped forward, overcome with despair. "Don't answer," he yelled, grabbing the maid's arm. "You have no right to speak here." The violent gesture caused the entire hall to react with indignation. Some guests stood, others screamed in shock. The mason overseeing the exterior decorations rushed in, alerted by the commotion. And at that moment, as if fate had decided, the pendant slipped from the maid's hands and fell to the marble floor. The metallic sound reverberated, echoing through the hall like a bell announcing a revelation. Everyone's eyes darted to the fallen object. The engraved coat of arms was unmistakable. There was no denying it. His wife took a step back, pale, unable to meet the collective gaze. The millionaire, now maskless, closed his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, as if watching his life crumble before everyone's eyes. And the maid, standing, though frail, understood. The secret was no longer just hers. Now it belonged to everyone in that room, and no one would ever forget what had happened that night. The pendant remained on the marble floor, gleaming in the golden light of the chandelier, like a piece of evidence no one could ignore any longer. The coat of arms engraved on it seemed to scream of its own accord, revealing secrets that had previously been buried beneath layers of silence. Guests leaned in, whispered, and pointed discreetly, and the Aaron's family name was repeated in an increasingly audible tone, like a ghost crossing the room. The pale wife was breathing rapidly. Her lips were pursed nervously. She looked to her husband for help, but he didn't move. The millionaire stood motionless, gripping his whiskey glass so tightly it felt like it would shatter. His silence was no longer a choice. It was a condemnation. An older diplomat, known for his rigor, took a few steps toward the maid and knelt to pick up the pendant. As he held it up before everyone, his voice sounded deep and solemn. "This coat of arms doesn't belong to just any family. It belongs to the Aarons, an ancient lineage that would never allow its symbol to be used without reason." The hall erupted in murmurs. Some guests covered their mouths in shock, others recoiled as if afraid of something forbidden. The wife tried to intervene. "This is absurd," he shouted, his voice trembling. "It's a cheap imitation. This girl is trying to deceive us." But no one believed it. The way the millionaire remained motionless, unable to deny it, was the most devastating confirmation of all. Eyes turned to him, demanding an answer. He looked away, covered his eyes with his hand, and sighed deeply. The maid, tears still streaking her face, took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. For the first time that night she looked up, facing the audience. She didn't need to say much. Her silence, sustained by the force of the exposed truth, was already deafening. The diplomat handed her back the pendant, and she received it carefully, holding it close to her chest as if recovering not just a jewel, but an identity. The entire room awaited her words, but she remained silent. The lack of response was all the more powerful, because it allowed each guest to fill in the blank with their own conclusions. The desperate wife lunged at her again, trying to snatch the pendant from her hands, but this time the young woman grabbed her arm. Her eyes, blue as ice, stared intently into her mistress's, and in a low voice yet clear enough to echo throughout the hall, she said, "Don't try to erase what's already written." The sentence fell like a silent thunderclap. The entire room froze. The guests understood that the maid was not just a humiliated employee, but someone who carried within her a past, a story, and a truth that no one could bury. The millionaire finally dropped the glass to the floor. The glass shattered, scattering whiskey and shards across. The marble and the sound was like an unspoken confession. His wife stared at him in shock, realizing he had kept this secret all this time, and in that instant everyone knew. Humiliation had changed sides. The shard of glass was still scattering whiskey across the marble when silence fell again. Every guest seemed petrified, their eyes fixed on the scene that was becoming an irreversible revelation. The blonde maid, previously bent over by the weight of humiliation, now stood erect, the pendant against her chest. There were no more tears, only the firmness of someone no longer hiding. The trembling wife stared at her husband in disbelief. What she feared most was precisely what she saw before her, the silent confirmation that secrets lay buried within their own home, and that these secrets were now exposed for all to see. Her breathing was heavy, almost uneven, and every attempt to speak died before it could become sound. The millionaire sat with his hands on his knees, his head bowed. He was a man devoid of authority, a king without a crown. His guests, who had so often revered him, now watched him as one might watch a statue crumble in a public square. The weight of his omission screamed louder than any words could. The maid, taking a deep breath, finally spoke. Her voice was not loud but clear, like a blade cutting through the silence. "I spent my whole life hearing that I was nobody, that my place was to carry trays, clean floors, and keep quiet. Today, for the first time, you saw who I really am." The sentence reverberated in the room. The murmurs ceased, and for a few seconds no one dared interrupt. The wife, overcome with rage, tried to regain ground. "You're nothing but an insolent maid," she shouted, her voice cracking. "This hall, this house, all of it will never be yours." The blonde stared at her, steady, unwavering. Her eyes held pain, but also an unshakable truth. "I don't need it to be mine. I just need you to know I will never bow to your cruelty again." The impact was devastating. The entire hall reacted, not with applause, but with a dense silence, filled with respect. The guests, who minutes before had laughed at her embarrassment, now looked at her as if witnessing an awakening. The millionaire lifted his head, his eyes brimming with tears, looking at her for the first time not as a servant, but as someone who held power over him. His wife's gaze, in contrast, was one of pure hatred, but mixed with a fear she would never admit. The tension was growing. The guests knew this was no longer just an interrupted party, but the milestone of something bigger, the fall of an empire of appearances and the emergence of a new narrative. And for the first time, everyone understood. The maid didn't need to reveal every detail of her secret. The simple fact that she existed, firm, dignified, was enough to turn the tables and show that the humiliation had changed forever. The room no longer felt festive. The atmosphere was that of a silent courtroom. The millionaire, until then merely a spectator of the disaster, decided to stand up. His face was tense, sweat glistening on his forehead, and his voice was louder than it should have been. "Listen up, everyone," he shouted, trying to assert himself. "This is nothing more than a coincidence. You're letting a cheap piece of metal ruin my night." The guests looked at each other. No one responded. His tone held no conviction, but despair, and despair back then was the same as confession. The millionaire raised his arm, pointing at the maid. "You're treating her like she's someone important, but she's just that, a maid. There's nothing more to her than that." But the attempt to regain control backfired. The heavy silence was broken by muffled laughter, not of support but of disbelief. Some guests whispered, "If it weren't true, why would he be so nervous?" Others shook their heads in disapproval. The wife, who had been screaming louder than anyone, now stood, motionless. Her eyes stared at her husband with a mixture of anger and bitter realization. For the first time she understood that he had hidden something from her. The maid, for her part, didn't need to raise her voice. She simply pressed the pendant to her chest and held it up slightly, letting everyone see it. Her blue eyes, still teary, stared at each person present, one by one. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The millionaire, seized with panic, tried to approach. He reached out to snatch the pendant, but before he could touch it, one of the most respected guests, the elderly diplomat, intervened. "Don't do that," he said gravely. "What's done can't be undone." The scene was devastating. The millionaire recoiled, stunned. The glass he was holding slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor, scattering shards and liquid across the marble. The sound echoed like the announcement of his defeat. The guests no longer saw him as a host, but as a defendant. His wife now, with her arms crossed, did not defend him. She watched him fall alone, ruined by the secret he had tried so hard to hide, and the maid, erect, became the center of the room. Her silence was the final sentence. Every look, every whisper, every sigh confirmed it. The humiliation had changed hands. The hall seemed suspended in time. No one dared move, as if each guest knew they were witnessing something that would forever change the conversations, alliances, and social media presence of that mansion. The defeated millionaire stood before the blonde maid, his eyes empty, unable to bear the weight of the gazes that had once applauded him. The pendant still glinted in the young woman's hand, reflecting the golden light of the chandelier like an inextinguishable flame. With each passing second, the engraved coat of arms confirmed that the story was neither fabrication nor coincidence. It was true, a truth long kept silent. But that night, it emerged with devastating force. The wife, motionless, crossed her arms before her husband. Her cold gaze no longer sought answers. Deep down, she knew that his omission had allowed that secret to come to light. She had not only missed the party, she had lost the invisible crown that sustained her vanity in the eyes of others. The maid took a deep breath, her chest heaving, and then lifted her face. Her eyes, previously filled with tears, now shone with something no insult could erase: dignity. She didn't need to shout or raise her voice. One short sentence spoken firmly was enough to seal the night. "Today you laughed at me. Tomorrow you'll remember who I really am." The impact was like a silent thunderclap. The guests lowered their eyes in shame. No one dared contradict her. The millionaire, staggering, sank into the nearest armchair, his face covered with his hands. The sound of his muffled sobs echoed through the hall, confirming his doom. The blonde, in a short, simple uniform, towered over all the expensive dresses and starched suits around her. Her erect figure, illuminated by the chandelier, became a symbol of resistance. The guests knew that image would be etched in their memories, that of the humiliated woman who, without lifting a finger, toppled the arrogance of an entire family. The music, which had long since stopped, returned discreetly. It wasn't festive, it wasn't joyful. It was slow, almost funereal, like a farewell to the power of those who had reigned through fear and humiliation. With firm steps, the maid walked toward the door. Each click of her heels echoed like a sentence. She didn't apologize, didn't thank him. She simply left, leaving everyone's respectful silence with her. And when the door closed behind her, the room was no longer the same. The millionaire was shattered, his wife powerless, and the guests silently carried the weight of having witnessed the night the humiliated woman became a symbol of truth and courage. If this story has kept you hooked so far, leave a like and subscribe for more stories like this.